For a church that had the audacity to moniker themselves in a modern way after this spiritual mandate, it amazed me how little they wanted to do with the world outside. This was their space. This was where they were important, and that was all that mattered.
I spent the whole time you were in there just sobbing my eyes out because I was like, I don't understand these people. I don't understand why they hate so much.
The gospel of microculture is a problem, and it has been for a long time and will continue to be because of the narrow way that these people are taught to think.
This experience basically killed off any type of desire I really had to go into the ministry. Welcome to Unbound,
A podcast for new atheists
and lifetime atheists,
ex-evangelicals,
truth seekers, and free thinkers.
There is life after faith.
And life here is good. It's time for a new perspective.
And a better conversation. I'm Spider.
And I'm Shelle. And it's time to get unbound.
You know, I've said that this show is fueled by righteous anger. I'm having a hard time figuring out how much of this is righteous. And it's concerning because with all of my talk about not pointing fingers at individuals, I find myself kind of at a crossroads here. So with this particular episode, it is one that is very, very personal to me because of what it represented and what it did to me and just the way that I saw myself for such a long time. No, you should not be pointing fingers at individuals, and I'm going to stand by that. But when you are in the midst of a group, a collective group of individuals who are all being led by a single individual and learning things that are absolutely toxic, not just to your faith, but to your life in general, I feel like there is some finger pointing that needs to happen. So my co-host is sitting across from me, and she's just sort of watching, trying to see what's going to happen here. But those of you who understand the concept of righteous anger, those of you who have things in your life from that time in your life that you look back on and it still makes you furious, well, this one's for you. And I want to just start out real quick with a very brief appeal. Our Patreon links are all over our content. And if you go directly to our website, getunbound.org, that's get-unbound.org, you'll see it right there on the very first page. It's in the description for each episode. We really, really do need your help at this point. And I see this podcast going places. I'm watching what's happening with our downloads. I'm watching what's happening in terms of how people are consuming the content. And I'm flabbergasted by the response that we're getting, especially on certain platforms. So that's it. I'm not going to go too much further into any kind of an appeal. You know me. I don't like to sit here and beg for money. But I really do want to see this get better. And we are gaining new listeners every week. We're gaining new fans every week. I'm talking to new people on social media about the show every week. And it's even being spread a little bit by word of mouth. And that's the best part. Because one of the best ways that people find your podcast is by being told about it. So yeah, like, subscribe, share content, do all the things. But you know what? If you know someone personally who you really believe needs to hear what's going on here, just simply tell them about us. Tell them to search Unbound Podcast Network on YouTube or any place that you hear podcasts, because that's how you're going to find us. Just tell them what they're looking for, the type of content they're looking for, and go. That's how a lot of people learn about new podcasts that they like. Tell people. Just get out there and tell people that we are here. It's a great way to grow our audience, and also please do all the social media stuff. Like, share, subscribe, everything. We can use all the help we can get, whether it's money or just with support. And from what I can tell, we're getting some tremendous support for this show. And I thank you so much for that. And I thank you in advance for at least considering helping us out on Patreon. So now that my energy's up a little bit more, I can hear it in my own voice. Things are a little bit less tense. And the weed that I smoked right before I hit record is settling in. And this is, this particular strain is one that I have referred to before as my antidepressant weed, because it has this way of just unfogging everything. So I sat down to do this and I was very foggy. And now I'm thinking a lot more clearly. And I think that we're going to get a good objective story out of this. And just treat it as a warning for those of you who are still in Pentecostal evangelical religion. Treat this as a warning, because there's a lot of things going on in your church right now that mirror what I'm going to describe. Whether you see it outright or whether it's going on behind the scenes, a lot of what you're about to hear is happening in your church right now, especially if yours is a church that hasn't grown that much over the years. You see new people coming in all the time, and your pastor likes to talk about how the church is growing. Well, does he talk about the people who are leaving? Does he talk about the people who died and these people just sort of came in behind them? When you're talking about church growth, let's talk about what this church looked like 10 years ago and what it looks like today. Just because there are a bunch of new faces doesn't mean that the church grew. If there were 200 people in this church 10 years ago and there's 200 people in this church now, just because the faces are new doesn't mean that the church grew.
Right.
So, like I said, I've been following this particular church for quite a while, and just a lot of it has just been idle curiosity. Once in a while, I'll hear something or I'll hear from someone, and it will just spark curiosity. And every single time that I have gone to that website, it's just been the same shit, different day. I spent a lot of time looking over my shoulder. I'm going to put it that way. And from minute one, I was taught that that was the way that it needed to be. And it's very reminiscent of how I described my first semester at Bible college, where I walked into an environment and it was made immediately apparent to me that these people were in charge.
Right.
And, you know, I had the religious trauma syndrome even then, because I can remember walking into that board meeting for the first time and just having flashbacks of some of those really nasty interactions that I had with people early on at Valley Forge.
Oh, yeah.
So there were, again, from minute one, and I knew something was really, really off when I walked into that boardroom. But I don't want to get too far ahead. I want to give you a little bit of a timeline as to how this came around. So I had met and started interacting with the pastor of this church when I was interning during the summer between my junior and senior years of college. I was interning at my home church at Faith Assembly in Poughkeepsie, and the youth pastors in our section, then the Assemblies of God divides things by section and then by district. So a district can be one state, or it could be multiple states, or it could be parts of states. I mean, there are all kinds of ways that they divide it up. But we would have sectional youth pastor breakfasts. And at that point, the pastor of this church was the youth pastor, and I was familiar with, but hadn't really interacted much with, the guy who was the senior pastor there at the time. I had the opportunity to talk to him right before I took this position. And I mean, with all due respect, he never badmouthed anybody there, but anyone could read between the lines of what he was telling me. And I heard it, but I was 22 years old, and I was convinced that I could save the world, and I was convinced that I could go in there and make something really, really good out of a bad situation. In other words, I was just an impetuous little asshole. and that's really what it was. I was an impetuous little asshole with a pretty big ego, and I thought, you know, I've got this. it really doesn't matter what happened during the last 4 years. I know what my abilities are. I know who I am, and I know that I can do this. And I know that I can make something really, really good out of it. So I walked into this with really, really good intentions. But again, I'm getting ahead a little bit. After that summer, my youth pastor had started talking with this guy about some changes that were going on in the church. And I think that it was either halfway through or toward the end of these breakfasts that we were doing. I'm pretty sure we did this every week. Something had happened. I didn't have a whole lot of details at the time, but the senior pastor was out, and this guy was going to be in as the new senior pastor, which meant that before too long, they were going to need to get somebody in there to run the youth group and all of that. So, of course, my youth pastor was very quick to mention me. And now I'm going to go right on record here. The very first time I saw this guy walk into Denny's, I didn't like him. I thought that he looked smarmy. I thought that he looked arrogant. I thought that he looked like he was up to something. Now, I still, 30 years later, or almost, I guess it would be just about 30 years later at this point, I still don't have all the facts and details. I know what I've been told by certain other people, but I do not know precisely what was going on within the walls of that church. So I'm not about to point fingers of blame in one direction or another. But this guy, whenever he started talking about the senior pastor and the trouble that this church was in, he just had this look on his face and this tone in his voice that was so clearly and obviously opportunistic that I was kind of intimidated by him. But at the same time, he had a charisma and a confidence that I thought would be good to emulate. So it was kind of a catch-22. I knew I didn't like the guy, but I also thought that there were things that I could learn from him. There was something about this guy that I told myself, because he brought it up right there at the table at this breakfast, and I looked at my youth pastor, he looked at me, we were both thinking the exact same thing. And he brought up the possibility of me going to that church as the youth pastor. Well, there were things, there were real subtle little canaries in the coal mine that I did notice. But you see, I was good at ignoring back then. I was good at ignoring when I thought something was amiss because, again, I was a cocky asshole. And I thought that it didn't matter. I thought I could just go in there and just, clean up that one horse town. You know what I mean?
Yes.
And I learned very quickly through that experience that I was not super pastor, and that I probably never would be. And that if what I went through that first year was indicative of the next 50, it sure as shit wasn't anything that I wanted. So there I was, just wondering whether or not my life up to that point had meant anything. It started with them sending me their application packet and me sending them that plus my resume. And there were some interesting questions in this packet. And I did my best to answer honestly, like I always do, which had gotten me in trouble in the past in situations like this. But my thinking here is that, well, God's not telling me not to answer this way, so I guess it's okay. I don't feel convicted. I don't feel funny about it, so I guess it's okay. And some of those answers did spark questions when they finally had me in front of them. But the very first thing that I noticed when the pastor of that church opened the door and there were all of these guys just sitting there. They were literally sitting there by themselves in this room while I was sitting in the pastor's office with him. So I marched in there like it's a tribunal. And that was the first thing that I thought of. It's like, what is this, the Nuremberg trials? I mean, so I sort of just looked around, tried to put on the plastic smile, tried to make eye contact with everyone around the table. And once everybody was once again seated, because they did the whole thing where they stood up when we walked in, and I'm certain that was more for him than it was for me. And I kind of figured, this is just the way they do things. So everyone sat down, everything was settled, and the questions began. And they asked questions in ways that I could easily get trapped in the answers to. So I started countering with questions of my own and trying to get them to stop beating around the bush and ask me the question that they wanted to ask. So there was some back and forth there. It didn't sit right with a couple of them because, with all due respect, it was just another one of those examples of how I was just not going to be contained. And I was determined to show these people me, not the picture of me that they wanted, but me, because it was going to be me heading up this ministry. So if you don't like me, then you can tell me goodbye and go look for somebody else. Once we got past all the questions, and I wasn't being asked to leave the room or anything like that, there was just kind of a general consensus. People looked around at each other, and they looked up at the pastor, who was literally at the other end of the table from me. Remember Tim Burton's Batman?
Yeah.
Remember Bruce and Vicky's date?
Where they're like
and
all the way
40-foot long table? That's kind of what it felt like. He was all the way down at the other end, and I'm like asking him to pass the salt. Oh, so they all kind of looked at him, and then sort of it was almost robotic. They all kind of looked down at these papers that were in front of them. Some of them had things written on them, and some of them didn't. So I guess some of them had written down some questions that they wanted to ask me or whatever. But the weird part was I didn't see them looking at it when they were actually asking questions. And now all of a sudden they're fixated on this. I guess because now it was time for the senior pastor to speak and they wanted to attend to their master's voice. I don't know. But there was a weird vibe to it. But then the senior pastor started talking about what they were hoping to do for us. They said that we're hoping that by spring we're going to start covering some of your expenses, at least your housing. We want to at least cover your housing for you. And we want to see about getting you some kind of a stipend so that it makes your time coming out here worthwhile. And I thought that it was reasonable. When I looked around at the church, when I saw the types of people that went to the church, saw the cars that they drove, these were very middle-class people. It was a middle-class church. I could see where there would be money issues having a youth pastor on full-time. I was sympathetic to that. At that point, I was willing to give them the benefit of the doubt. They weren't showing me financial records or books or anything like that, but it seemed like they had limited resources. It was a nice building, but there were things that needed repair. They needed to do some work on their HVAC unit. That was the big one that was planned for months. There were some construction issues, things that they wanted to do on the property that they couldn't hire contractors to do. So they had guys in the church who already had experience or who were contractors and willing to volunteer some of their time to do some of this stuff around the church. So it was very blue collar. And all I really wanted at that point was an outlet for all of this stuff that I had bottled up that I wanted to do for young people and that I wanted to do for, well, with all due respect, for my Savior who died for me. I wanted to bring his message to these kids in a way that was going to be effective. And that was the way that I used to pray. I used to say, Lord, just give me what I need to be effective for these kids, for them to be able to relate to me, for them to be able to like me, for them to, whatever it was. And of course, I'm praying this, and all it's doing is building up these concepts in my head so that I can start projecting them a little bit more. So this church was very blue collar. And I gave them the benefit of the doubt and decided once the offer was made, which took a while, but once the offer was made, I decided that what they were offering was reasonable. And I also was able to read between the lines of, we want to make sure we like you first, and then we'll start paying you. And I was okay with that. And I was also taught to believe that it was in poor taste to talk about being paid for doing ministry work, which is complete and utter bullshit, because when I look at my Bible, it says the worker is worthy of his hire.
Yeah.
So if I'm doing work for you, then I'm worthy of something. I'm worthy of something, okay? But after about a 2-month battle with the board, which started in June and ended around the middle or end of August, I was finally ready to start putting together something for this church, for their youth group. And I was off to an okay start. Everything seemed to be working pretty smoothly. I was actually surprised at how smoothly things were running. But there were things early on that you noticed, particularly about his wife.
Yeah.
So let's talk about that just for a couple of minutes.
Yeah. Well, I knew that she'd had several kids, and she never was well when she was pregnant. So, like, every time she was pregnant, it was like a life-threatening thing, but they still were having children. And I was like, how? How are you still having kids? She was having kids, and every single time was like, oh, she's in the hospital now, or oh, she's on complete bed rest and cannot, like, do anything. And how do you function that way?
But here's the thing.
Yeah.
And I'm going to play devil's advocate just a little bit here.
Oh, yeah.
Okay. As much as I dislike this guy, I hardly think that he was pinning her down and forcing her to do anything.
Oh, no.
Okay.
No.
And I'm certain that by the time the second or third kid came around, they understood why it was happening. And if they both chose that this was what they wanted, then we really can't weigh it on one side more than the other.
Oh, no. It's just the mindset that God wants us to have as many kids as possible.
Right.
And that's always an influence somewhere.
And like that lady that came up to us and criticized us because we had the audacity to decide to stop at one.
Yeah.
Liam was autistic. There were a lot of things that we were dealing with, and I had huge misgivings about having any more kids. For starters, I wanted my son to have a life, and I thought that there was a better chance of him having a life if I didn't have siblings to contend with.
Yeah.
And that was part of the decision right there. And another part of it was simply that I had been such a shitty father to him as a kid that I didn't want to put another kid through that because I knew me.
And I was really no better with all of my undiagnosed at the time anxiety issues and also just depression. And it's not fun for a kid to have to deal with that.
No. And I mean, I won't make excuses for any of the stupid shit that I did and the mistakes that I made with him. But when you're not getting the help that you need, it is impossible to improve. Yeah. So I didn't start getting better until I reached a point where I couldn't live with me anymore. And when I reached a point where I couldn't live with me anymore, then I went looking for a better me.
Yeah.
And within a week, I went on that diet and I started therapy.
Yeah.
I dropped an entire adult male, went from almost 400 pounds down to 200 pounds and have stayed pretty close to that weight since. And that same week, I started therapy, and I have been in therapy with just a couple of small lags along the way ever since then. That started in 2013.
Yeah.
Yeah. So once I started getting help, that's when things got better. Once I started getting competent help, because you know what help looks like in this environment.
Yes.
In the evangelical environment.
Oh, yeah. Mm-hmm.
So we're veering off. I want to make sure that we stay on topic here. So yeah, the whole business with them and the number of kids and the problems that she was having, it bothered me too. But I also knew that it was none of my business.
Yeah.
And I also understood that it takes two to tango. And that if this was something that she was having a problem with, then that was something she needed to discuss with her husband. And they weren't too worried about the consequences or what it could do to her, that this was God's will. And if kids were going to come, they were just going to come. After that 2 months of hell going back and forth with the board, I think it was another one of these situations where certain people had asked for clarification on something, and then they brought me in again. And there was more beating around the bush with questions that I had to deflect and say, look, if it's worth asking, then ask.
Right.
And I think I actually used those words right there in that room the second time they brought me in, which was around, I want to say, the end of July, because it was, because then I got the offer maybe like a week or two after that.
Right.
So it was another one of those situations where I had these guys sitting there and trying to get me to say something without them having to embarrass themselves into asking the questions. And I was having none of it. And the same people decided they were going to have issues with me. So I honestly, I have no idea how I got in.
Yeah.
I think that at the end of the day, the senior pastor saw something that he liked and basically told them, look, I'm going to do this and you're going to help and you're going to be, and he used these words with me in that meeting, and you're going to be committed to his success. He said the exact same thing to me in front of them. He said,
Right.
if we decide that we want to move forward with this, we are committed to your success. Note the pregnant pause. I'm leaving that in.
Yeah.
So let's talk a little bit about what commitment to the youth director's success looked like in this church. So had my first meeting right around Labor Day, right after Labor Day. And students were all back in school. And that meant that it was fall. And this is when, again, it's all marketing. This is when people start thinking about youth group. Okay.
Right.
So bringing me in at this point was, I don't know if it was a knowingly strategic move, but it was a strategic move because it was the best time of year to get people to come out. As it started getting a little bit colder out, they would want indoor activities, and we were supplying that from right after Labor Day forward. And I don't think in the entire time that I was there that I missed a single Friday night.
Oh, no.
I don't think that there was a single time where I missed anything at that church.
One time.
When we got into that accident, right?
Yeah, that was the only time.
I think that we had a good excuse.
Yeah.
And yeah, there was no youth group for 2 weeks. I was out for 2 Sundays. And I still, no clue how we walked away from that and walked out of the hospital that same night. It's a fun story, but it's not for tonight.
Yeah.
It's an interesting story because I spent years believing that my life had been spared.
Yeah.
Okay. And I guess it is significant. I'll talk about it a little bit just from that point forward, because we had literally only been at this for like about a month.
Right.
This happened in late October, so about 2 months. So we had our first meeting. There were between 15 and 18 kids that showed up. I had bought snacks. I got some soda, got some chips, just real simple stuff that I just thought for sure we would get reimbursed for because it's something for the youth group. And when I asked to be reimbursed for this stuff, I was told, oh, but it wasn't approved. It wasn't something that we said you could buy. So, sorry. That was basically the answer that I got. And I said, okay, so then I guess we need to discuss what the protocols are when we need something for the youth group. Is there an account for them? Do we have money put aside for X, Y, and Z? And how much is there? And as it turned out, there was. And I knew how much was in there. And anything that we brought in during the offerings, and yes, we passed the plate around to a bunch of 13, 15, and 16-year-olds. Don't get me started. Actually, no. This church was not a pass the plate, but we had the box.
Yes.
We had the box for offerings and directed them to it, and just sort of kind of placed it right at the end of the line. Okay, there's your snacks. Now pay up. And that was kind of the message that was being sent there. And it wasn't supposed to be done in an intimidating way, but more in a manner of, okay, now you need to think about this from both sides. You got something, now give something. So in that regard, it's not that bad of a lesson. But in the context of money, it can take on all kinds of connotations.
Yeah.
There are better ways to teach giving and getting than to put an offering plate at the end of the line with the snacks. So, but that was where my mind was. And as I've said many times before, I've forgiven myself for all of this stuff. Forgiveness kind of ended at the threshold of this particular church, though, because I ran into some of the worst people that I have ever met in or out of Christianity within the walls of this church. But early on, things were not that bad. We had a few meetings. I learned how to tap the petty cash to get the snacks. I learned how to function within this microculture, and that is precisely what it was. And it was a very tight-knit microculture. And it was a microculture that kind of squeezed out the previous senior pastor, because I feel like this guy's biggest crime was that he was a little bit too much of a traditionalist. And there were a few people in that church, more than a few people in that church, that wanted to see a more modern spin taken on things. So that was kind of what I gleaned from the conversation that I had with him when I was working at the radio station, because that's how I actually really started to interact with this guy. Not to backtrack, but to give a little bit of background. The senior pastor of this church, the predecessor to the guy that I worked with, he showed up at the radio station where I was working. And this was during a fundraising weekend. God, they love their fundraisers. Everything's fundraising. And by they, I mean the church in general and any face you want to put on it. But this was the radio station that I was working for in upstate New York. And they were bringing in people from local churches. And it was kind of a way of introducing the greater community to everyone who supports the station, basically.
Right.
So if your church made monetary donations to the station, then your pastor was invited to be part of this. And this guy happened to be one of several people that I wound up interviewing. And in the course of that, I need to know a little bit about him. And we did sit down and talk for a while. And he kind of cut into the conversation with, now, just so I'm clear, you're the guy that they're talking about bringing in at Mission Impossible. Mm-hmm. And I said, yeah. I said, I didn't really want to bring this subject up because I know it's a sore subject. But yes, I'm definitely considering it. And I looked at him. I said, should I be? And he, again, never said anything bad or negative to me about these people. But there was a lot to be read through what he was saying. Everything that he said to me that day, it was just peppered with all kinds of warnings.
Yeah.
So when I saw certain things, I was not surprised. But the first couple of times, I'm like, oh, I can deflect this. This isn't going to be a problem. That was the first couple of times. Once certain people started becoming more vocal, and once certain things started happening that people didn't like, all of a sudden, every opinion is known. And it's getting louder and getting louder and getting louder. You see what happened here? What happened here is that I crashed their microculture. Mm-hmm. I crashed their culture and tried to do what the name of their church suggests that I was there to do. Okay? 5 times in the New Testament, we are presented with a couple of verses that are referred to as the Great Commission.
Right.
Most notably, and the one that's quoted most often, is Matthew 28:19. Go ye therefore into all the world and preach the gospel, baptizing in the name of the Father and of the Son and of the Holy Ghost. So, and there's more to it before and after, but that's the gist. For a church that had the audacity to moniker themselves in a modern way after this spiritual mandate, it amazed me how little they wanted to do with the world outside. It amazed me at how exclusionary they were. It amazed me at the country club mindset that existed there among largely working class people. This was their space. This was where they were important, and that was all that mattered.
Yeah.
Another pregnant pause that I'm leaving in. So, as it was, I had been spending about 20 hours a week at this church on average. That's on top of working 2 jobs and having a 1-day-a-week gig at the radio station that I almost wasn't allowed to do because that gig was on Sunday nights. And it was kind of expected that I was going to be in church But when the opportunity to do that came up, I sat down with the senior pastor and I said, look, I need to make some money here. Okay. And if the church is not in a position to help me, then can you at least loosen the reins enough to and be satisfied with the fact that I am doing ministry? This isn't supposed to be about us. It's supposed to be about the gospel. That I will be doing ministry, but someplace else during that time.
Right.
Can we just make people understand this? And I mean, with all due respect, they can hear me on their way to church. They can hear me on their way back from church. They're going to know what I'm doing. And almost everybody who recognized me from the radio station at that church was pretty supportive of me doing this.
Right.
Because with all due respect, I was good at it. I was definitely good at it. And the people who just ran into me on the street and recognized my voice were always, they were very cordial and they were very supportive. And that was true in this church too. But even that little bit of celebrity that I walked in with really wasn't enough to impress hardly any of them. And, that's fine with me. I wasn't there to be impressed by all the great stuff that I was doing. Look at me. I work at a radio station and I'm behind the mic and I'm talking to all these people. It wasn't even something that I felt fueled my ego, because at that point it was just ministry. It was what I was supposed to be doing. And, I had a talent for doing that. So I was doing it.
Right.
And I wanted to continue doing it. And I could do something in ministry and get paid, which wasn't happening within those walls. So reluctantly, they decided to let me do this. Now I'm hitting the airwaves every Sunday night instead of going to the church. And that definitely raised a few people's hackles too. Because even though certain people who were very vocal didn't even have kids in the youth group, we're talking about a senior pastor who wore many, many faces. And in front of certain members of his congregation, it was a face of fear. He was very fearful of certain people in that church. He was fearful of people on the board. And again, I don't know all the particulars of how the previous pastor was booted and this guy got his job. I don't know. Because even when I sat down and talked to him that day, he refused to say anything bad. So it all remains a mystery to me. But I see the fruits of the decisions that they made, or I saw. Let's be fair, it was almost 30 years ago. I saw at that time the fruits of what that church had gone through. There was an eerie respect and loyalty to this guy among certain people. And then there were certain people who were always, you had the pardoners and then you had the summoners. Okay. And the summoners were pretty aggressive.
Yeah. And
I can only imagine that this was the aftermath of all of that. This whole us and them thing that I saw even among their ranks, where out in front of everybody else, they're showing brotherly camaraderie, but in other settings, in the board meetings and where things got a lot more real, you really saw certain people's true colors. And some of those colors were beautiful, and some of them were ugly. Most of them were ugly. Most of them were very ugly. And the few rays of reason and wisdom that did come through were stifled by all of the static that the rest were putting out there. So it was difficult for the ones that had good intentions and good intentions toward us to even have a voice. But there were those who did. There were people who had us to their homes before, after church. One family in particular had us over for breakfast a lot after church. And a couple of years later, I had heard that one of their kids had gotten injured in an ATV accident. And I got to spend an evening with them, have some dinner, visit with them. I was still doing what I was doing when I was there, because I had kind of put myself in a position where I had certain kids in that group that really trusted me, really liked me. And the way that things went down, and everybody knew why I left when I did, but the way that things went down, it had to be jarring for them. And it wasn't like I could just maintain contact with underage people.
Right.
Okay? It wasn't like that. Their families had to be involved. Well, the ones who knew how important I was to their kids kept me involved even after I was done.
Yeah.
there were at least two of those families, and one in particular that was so just off the map hospitable to us. One family in particular that I think of as being one of those anchors, things that I thought about, people that I thought about when I wanted to throw in the towel and didn't want to deal with this thing called Christianity anymore. This family was among the ones that always popped into my mind and reminded me that there were good ones.
Yeah.
And then that same kid was taken from them just a couple years after that.
Yeah.
And at that point, we had kind of lit out of town, and I didn't hear about it for quite a while, and certainly way too much time had passed for me to reinsert into that situation. Part of me wishes that I had contacted them, but part of me is very glad that after a while I left well enough alone with everything associated with that church, because even the ones that were supportive to us, they were so few and far between that it made no sense to even try and form alliances.
Yeah.
You know? But I don't even know if this guy that I worked with knew that I was still seeing some of the kids in his youth group at their homes with their parents. Okay, don't start. I wonder if he knows, because what was he doing with his youth ministry at that point where the parents of these kids still thought that it would kind of be a good thing to have me around?
Yeah.
You know? Mm-hmm. What was going on? What were you doing to fulfill your mission with these kids? There was kind of a long-ish stint there where I wasn't thrilled with the way things were going, but things seemed stable.
Yeah.
So I had learned to go with the flow with a lot of things that I didn't like in that place. And there were things that kept me from going crazy, not the least of which being the guys who played with us in the worship band.
Oh, yeah, they were great guys.
They were, and they were so much fun to hang out with, and they had brains, and they thought about things, and it was so nice being in the presence of smart people. And these two guys in particular, incredibly smart people. I loved being around them. I can even forgive that they were theists. I can even forgive it because they were so genuine, and they were real, and they were a couple of those few examples in that church of people who were. And I honestly, I wish that we had stuck around long enough so that maybe I could have jammed out with them a little bit more. Yeah. Because they didn't always do worship music. Okay. Right. One of them was actually in a band with one of our other friends in New York for a while, and that was not a Christian band.
Right.
Okay.
Yeah.
And, I've heard stories about, some of the things that these guys had done. One of them was working on some kind of a degree. I forget whether it was his master's or a doctorate at that point, but this was the level of intelligence that we were dealing with. And of course we gravitated toward them, and they were the ones that we went out with after church a lot.
Yeah.
And hung out with at other times too. So there was a long period of time where I just kind of used these anchors to keep myself emotionally in the place where I needed to be. And it worked to a greater or lesser extent. I kind of had an eyes on the prize mentality with a lot of this. In the very beginning, when it was when the senior pastor had announced that I was going to be taking over the high school Sunday school, well, the person who was teaching the high school Sunday school didn't like that very much. So of course she went to the Sunday school director, who was also on the board, who in turn asked to see me along with the senior pastor. And I can remember sitting there in that room and having this guy literally point his nasty finger at me and say, I don't care who this guy is. If she wants to keep teaching the class, she's going to keep teaching the class. And I'm looking at the senior pastor, and it's like, okay, who's the sheep and who's the shepherd here? And I'm kind of ashamed that I thought of it in that way now, but that was where my mind was then. So I'm literally done. That's what I'm thinking. It's like the sheep is leading the shepherd here. And I could see intimidation.
Yeah.
And what a red flag that is. Because if you are in a position of authority and your subordinates are able to walk all over you, then that's not in any way, shape, or form a recipe for success. I don't care if you're at that church for 3 decades. It doesn't mean that you're successful. It just means that you've managed to ingrain this thinking in enough people's heads that they keep coming back for more. It's not really success. It's just that you're following a formula and you're following it well. And as I've said in previous episodes, these formulas don't change much. The evangelical mindset doesn't change much. This guy has found something that works and he's made a career out of it. Now, I mean, I'd be impressed if what he was doing wasn't so shitty for society.
Yeah.
But he figured something out. That's all I know, is that he figured something out and has made a almost 30-year go of this. Probably more than 30 years at this point.
Yeah.
He's been associated with that church for that long. So we're going to fast forward a bunch of months, because we talked about the way that we would do the fall retreats when I did my episode on speaking in tongues. And I was in charge of the youth group there just long enough to do one of these retreats. And again, kind of thrust into doing music and not a whole heck of a lot else. But there were a couple of things that were major red flags at that point. So this is a couple of months in. Things have been smooth sailing, and all of a sudden I'm starting to see little things starting to bubble up. For starters, I can't drive the church vans because their insurance policy doesn't insure anyone under 25.
Mm-hmm.
So now I'm, one of the kids? Because that's kind of how it felt.
Yeah.
It's kind of how it felt. Me sitting there in the passenger seat and one of the parents driving the van.
Mm-hmm.
And a lot of that was going on.
Yeah.
And it was noticed and it was embarrassing. And again, I didn't say anything at the time because I could believe at the time that there wasn't money for this. But I couldn't drive the vans. That was a big problem right there. And not being able to be the leader was a huge problem here. Yeah. But there were a lot of people in that church that didn't want to see me as the leader. There were a lot of people in that church that didn't even want me to have a title. And my title was bullshit. They called me their youth director. Okay? I was their youth pastor. Get over it. I was the youth pastor at that church. But right. They didn't want to give me that title because with it came certain responsibilities that a lay title just didn't carry.
Right.
They didn't want to treat me like clergy because they knew that if they did that, they'd have to treat me better than average.
Right.
And they didn't want to treat me better than average. Here's an idea of how they did want to treat me. Fast forward a bunch of months, and I am now taking these kids to the annual youth convention in Syracuse. Okay?
Yeah, I didn't go to that.
No, I don't remember exactly why, but no, you didn't.
I think I had to work.
Okay.
I think it was just very important that I work because, well,
yeah,
money.
Because you weren't getting any paid time off at that point.
No.
It was too early on.
Yeah.
So, yeah, we couldn't afford for you to not have those 3 days pay. And, they didn't like that at all. And it's like, well, there's a reasonable solution to this problem. Okay. Yeah. She'll take the 3 days off and you compensate her for what she would have made at Walmart. It makes perfect sense to me, but that wasn't even something that was going to be considered at that point.
Oh, no.
So, no, you were not there. I also had the worst case of laryngitis that I think I have ever had. Well, second worst that I've ever had during that particular trip. So now, but I could drive a van because we had so many kids going to convention that we needed an extra van, and they sprung for the insurance for those couple of days for me to be able to drive that van. So for once, I get to be the leader. Okay? And I drive these kids all the way to Syracuse, and it was a white-knuckled ride because I had parents that were yip-yapping and saying things that were, you know how people talk and they're like having a conversation with each other, but they're talking to you and it's just sort of going past you.
Yeah.
You know what I mean? Where that what they're talking about pertains to you, but they're not naming names and they're being just general enough to be able to turn around later and say, oh no, I never said that. Mm-hmm. It's one of those. So there was a lot of that was going on. One of the parents in particular that sat up front with me was a little bit more hospitable, and we had a nice conversation. And then there was that one kid who had the developmental delay, and I had him sit up front with me for a little while too because he was getting antsy. And his father, though, was he was one of the gadflies, and he was one of the ones that I don't think liked the decision to bring me in if his absolutely vile treatment of both me and my wife was any indication. The way that he spoke to us, and to me in particular, I mean, to this day, I don't think that anyone has, at least on a continuing basis, ever spoken to me the way this guy did. And he was so two-faced about it that he was smiles when other board members were around or when anyone he considered important was around. But he used to like to do this thing where he would get up right close to me and lean in. And in the nastiest tone of voice that you can imagine, he would say all kinds of shit in my ear. And in this basic kind of tone of voice, like, well, now, no, blah, 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 no, 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 no. And that was all I allowed myself to hear, because if I really seriously listened to anything that this prick was saying, then I probably would have hauled off and smacked him. Okay? Remember, years before anger management. All right? Yeah. And this guy, I'm sorry, if there was anybody in that place that I would have thought, if there was anyone in that place that I thought it would have been worth losing the quote unquote job over, it would have been this guy. But at the time, I was thinking that my job here is to be the better person. My job is to show him what the actual Christ-like example is here. This is what's going on in my head. I'm pissed off at him. Yeah. But even in my pissed off brain, I'm thinking, okay, so the best thing you can do here is just show him better and show him that you're better. It was the way that I dealt with the person who came up to me after service one Sunday, took me by both hands and said, I just want to tell you something from the heart. I really don't think that you're the person the Lord wants here working with our kids. But while you're here, you have my support and you have my prayers. How's that for, I mean...
Yeah, it's like, thanks?
I don't even know how to categorize a statement like that.
It's like, gee, thanks, I think?
Thanks, I think is probably the best, but that's not what I said. I don't think I even said anything. It took so long to process it. I think I was still trying to figure out what she actually said when we were driving home.
Probably. Okay.
So we were talking about their commitment of support. Okay. Now remember, these people are committed to my success. All right. So when we went on that convention, we had nothing. We had no money. Okay.
Yeah.
It was not a good situation that we were in. We were on our own for the first time and not doing well with it.
No.
Okay.
And you had laryngitis, which meant you couldn't work.
Right. I couldn't work at the station. I couldn't work at and actually I did once or twice. They brought me in to do a couple of things, but not on the air. I was doing some production stuff because I just couldn't do my job. So they pulled somebody off production and put me back there to do some stuff while someone else was on the air. So I still got paid for my time, which was very nice. But.
Yeah. But you also had like 2 telemarketing jobs and you couldn't do either of those either. So we had no money.
Yeah. So that was a huge problem. And I literally left for this weekend with $20 in my pocket. Because when I went and asked our senior pastor if I could have some money so I could, I don't know, fucking eat during this thing.
Yeah.
More excuses. Well, that's something that needs to go through the board. That was the standard answer. Anytime I asked for anything monetary, it had to be run by the board. It's like, yeah, but you know what? We're kind of leaving tomorrow. So there isn't going to be a board meeting between now and then. So can I tap some petty cash? Can I tap some of the youth group funds so that I can actually have a meal here and there?
Yeah.
I ate twice.
Yeah. That's
between when we left early on Wednesday morning and when we got back home late Saturday night, I had eaten twice.
Yeah. I was not happy at all. I was really disgusted.
Now, in the plus column, the only reason I ate twice was because someone caught wind of what was happening. And when we all stopped at Wendy's and everyone was eating and I was just gabbing, this person came up to me and said, "You don't have any money, do you?" I said, "No, I really don't." And I came out here with next to nothing and no one was really willing to help. She's like, she hands me a $5 bill and says, "Go get yourself some lunch. You've done a lot for us this weekend. And it really just doesn't sit well with me." It was words to that effect. It was like something along the lines of, I feel bad for the way that this has been handled. Something along those lines. It was that sentiment. So there I was sitting there having my Wendy's single and my Diet Coke, and I don't think I ever tasted anything so good at that point, because I was hungry and I convinced myself, you're going to fast and pray for these kids. That's what this is going to be about. You're not going to let it be about being angry at these people for sending you this far from home, not even caring if you live or fucking die. Okay? We're not going to think about these people right now. We're going to think about the fact that you are here, that you have a job to do, and that there are kids in this youth group that still need Jesus. So I'm offering these meals that I am not going to be able to have on their behalf and interceding for them. That was the way that I decided to treat that. Okay. When I came back with my receipts for the meal and the couple of small snacks that I had purchased during that trip, I was once again told that the decision to reimburse me had to go through the board. While I was still there, one of the parents who had chaperoned this trip with us walked in with her receipts. Her receipts were tallied. She was handed money from petty cash. I watched it happen.
Yeah.
That is what they called being committed to my success. That's just one example. I don't have 6 hours. I'm not going to get into everything.
Yeah.
But that was a glowing example of their commitment to my success, as was the board meeting that I was invited to in the spring, where I knew this was going to happen, where I was sat down and it was explained to me that they still did not have the means to cover our housing or part of our housing or anything like that. We're hoping that by fall we'll be able to do this. And it's like, gee, I sense a pattern emerging here. But I didn't say anything.
Yeah.
I just sort of took it in stride until about a week later, when I was asked to come in for a meeting with the senior pastor, where I sat across his desk from him and was told that when the time came to actually pay a full-time youth pastor, that they intended to, quote, consider other applicants.
Yeah.
Now, keep in mind that by the time this had happened, we had already gone through everything that I've already talked about. And there were other things. In the dead of winter, in one of the worst winters that I can remember, in the beginning of 1994, those of you in the know and who were living in the Northeast know precisely what I mean. Every Wednesday, every Saturday, like clockwork, from late December until the beginning of April. We were getting snow every couple of days, and not small amounts.
No, it was crazy.
Now, a lot of these storms happened on Wednesdays. We had our midweek service at the church on Wednesday. On 2 separate occasions, we couldn't reach, I don't know what the problem was. I know that we couldn't reach anybody about whether or not there was still going to be this. And sometimes it was on the radio, sometimes it wasn't. Either way, you tell your fucking youth director. Okay? There were at least 2 times that Shelle and I drove from where we were living to where this church was, which was about 25 minutes on the road under optimal conditions, having not been told that service was being canceled. And you know what? We had enough common sense that if it was a blizzard,
Yeah.
we kind of knew, and if we couldn't get a hold of anybody, it's like, look, it's blizzarding out here. But we're talking about storms that would sort of come in like the night before. They'd be done about midday-ish. And the roads were starting to become a little bit more okay, but still not completely okay. Still treacherous enough right after a snowstorm that you don't want anybody out there if they don't need to be.
Right.
But on at least 2 occasions, they canceled service and no one ever called to inform us.
Oh, yeah.
And we got to church and there was nobody there. I mean, literally everyone else had been told. And it just wasn't a thought in their heads to let us know. Why? Because we weren't part of their microculture.
Right.
And I don't think that it was malicious. I don't think that this was something that they intentionally did. I just think that we were that invisible and that insignificant to most of them.
Oh, yeah.
That it just wasn't a thought in anybody's head to do it. And there were some very nice people at that church who were in charge of this sort of one lady in particular. I liked her a lot. But for fuck's sake, call. We live 25 minutes away when the roads are clear.
Right.
So, again, real commitment to our success. Okay. Now you're wasting my time, my gas, and putting me in danger, and are completely and totally unapologetic about it. Here's where we get to the best part of the story. Another pregnant pause that I'm leaving in. So, we had this group of kids, unchurched kids, that had made their way into our youth group. They were friends of a couple of families in the church. They were getting rides from families in our church. They were attending the services. They were behaving themselves for the most part. They were kids.
Yeah.
Okay. But they were respectful to me. They were respectful from what I could see to pretty much everyone around them. I didn't ever hear of them getting into any kind of arguments, altercations, scrapes, or anything with anyone. But they were unchurched. And to that end, they didn't fit this church's microculture. Now, remember I said earlier that there was a real country club mentality going on here. That these middle-class white people, predominantly, had this space that was theirs, and they intended to protect it. So, we had a situation where some of these kids were smoking outside the building after the youth group service. And it concerned some people. Now, you got to understand that we're talking about a time where most high schools still had smoking patios.
Yeah.
All right? It was not outside the realm of normalcy to simply provide a place for this to happen as opposed to trying to police it. Because I figure if I go too preachy on them, we're going to lose them.
Right.
So I sat down with our senior pastor and we started talking about these kids that had come into the youth group. And I said to him, and this was just him and me in the room, I said, you know, I understand the ramifications here, the whole underage aspect of it. I get that. But I also understand that when I was in high school, I used to hang out on the smoking patio with the stoners and the metalheads. And I watched teacher after teacher walk right by and mind their own business and not ask how old anybody was or anything like that. It was a place that was being provided to do this, and it was sort of kind of an island unto itself. And I said, I don't see any real reason why we have to police this if they keep it to themselves and if they and if they're not leaving their butts all over the place. Let's give them a place that is out of sight, off to the side of the building. Let's give them some kind of a receptacle so that they're not flicking their butts into the churchyard.
Right.
And let's just kind of go with the flow. They're coming to services. They are participating. and they're enjoying it and they like me. Let's try and keep the momentum up with this.
Right.
And he agreed. He sat there and he agreed.
Right.
Okay. So what changed his mind? Because he did change his mind. What changed his mind is that one of these kids, he committed a minor indiscretion, which I to this day believe was just a social gesture more than anything else, where he offered a cigarette to one of the kids of one of the board members in the church. And this board member turned around and made a huge stink about it.
Yeah.
Which surprised me because up to that point, this was a family that was really supportive of us.
Right.
Okay. So, and if there was anybody in this church that I thought would be a little bit more go with the flow, it was this guy, but I was wrong. Okay. So one minor indiscretion in that area. Apparently, a couple of parents on their way to pick their kids up from youth group heard a couple of these kids use some words they didn't like. And again, and now I have a bigger problem because we've got smoking and now we've got swearing. Oh my goodness. This is a problem in this tiny little microculture that's used to having things the way they want them.
Yeah.
Okay. So this is just par for the course. The final thing, and I have to admit that this one did concern me a little bit until I got the details. Apparently, and as it had been told to me, one of these kids then turned around and sort of kind of made an inappropriate comment to one of the girls in the youth group about a certain part of her body. We're talking eons of human nature here. I don't know too many 14, 15-year-old boys who have the decorum to realize that that's not the type of thing that you just do, especially not to a girl who you don't know that well, who comes from an environment like this. They're not inventorying all of this. They're inventorying their hormones and nothing else. And that's just the way that it is. So it concerned me until I understood just how innocuous the comment was. It wasn't about her body. It was just basically, it was a compliment that was made in a tone of voice that made it sound a little bit more come hithery, that sort of thing. Okay. But he just basically said something nice to her. It was said in a way that questioned what his motives might have been.
Right.
Okay. I know a lot of 15-year-old boys with questionable motives. I was one of them. So, with all due respect, it wasn't the type of thing that I thought should have raised the stink that it did. But given the environment that we were in, it really shouldn't have surprised me either.
Yeah.
So about a week later, we arrive at church on Bring a Friend Day. Now, you've got to see this scene. It's almost fucking comical, okay? You got to see this in your head. A bunch of people who've never been in this church before. Church is a lot fuller than it usually is. There are things going on that normally don't go on because now, of course, we've got to put on the show. This is just like, remember when HBO used to do their free weekends?
Oh, yeah.
And they would show the best stuff that they had.
Yep.
All weekend long. It's like, this is what the service is like. And then you subscribe, and then for the next 3 weeks, you're watching Meatballs. So, I mean,
Yes.
Yeah. So this is pretty much what this was. They were showing the best of what this church had to offer because it was Bring a Friend Day. That means that it's time to sell your church. So that's what they were doing. They were trying to sell people on the concept of going to this church. Well, I don't know how it started. I don't care how it started. But, I mean, these things always start with one or two really loud voices that rouse the rabble, and things just escalate from there. Well, things really, really did escalate. Okay? To the point where there was a line outside the pastor's office on Bring a Friend Day, a line of angry people that wanted to have their voice heard about this guy who was running the youth group. they couldn't fit everyone in the room who wanted to be in there. But that office was crowded. Okay? It was really, really, really crowded to the point where I was shoulder to shoulder with people in this room. And there were people sitting 2 layers of sheep behind me.
Yeah.
Okay? I was in this enclosed space, feeling very claustrophobic. And this same pastor who told me that he was in line with everything that I was trying to do. And you know what? One kid did step out of line and offer somebody a cigarette, but it wasn't done in a way that was peer pressury. It was more of a social gesture than anything else. And when the kid said no, that was the end of the conversation. Okay? That kid was talked to, didn't happen again, period. Same thing with the other stuff. I made general announcements about, watch your mouths, do this, do that. Just try and keep it down to a level. So I was doing what I felt I needed to police it.
Right.
Okay. And had also been told that he was okay with the way I was handling these situations. Everything that I was told behind closed doors with just him made it sound like he was on board with what I was doing. But as soon as a board member's kid was offered a cigarette, all of a sudden I saw his other face. I knew it was in there. It just took some time for it to really come out. I mean, I had seen it in a more passive aggressive way, but I saw the opportunist come out during this meeting. I saw him go full on smarm and sit there across that desk from me and say, Joe, just one question for you. Do you have any concern whatsoever about the safety, the well-being, and spiritual health of the kids in this church? Here was my response. There's more. God, there is so much more that I could report on what happened in this meeting. Having this one girl who was always just really rude and vile to both of us and to a lot of people around her too. She was not a nice kid.
No.
And having her stand there with her crocodile tears and say directly to my face, the problem that most of us have with you is that we just don't feel like you love us. In the meantime, I'm there at least 20 hours a week, and I'm growing the youth group, and I'm doing everything that I can to get just a little bit of support out of this place. And I'm working 3 jobs on the outside. I have no time that's mine.
Yeah.
But that wasn't enough. We just don't feel like you love us. And I looked at her and I said, I don't know if that's the most hurtful thing that anyone has ever said to me, but it ranks high. I'm sorry if that truly is the way that you feel. But look around once in a while and see what's changed since I got here. Look around and see what you have that you didn't have before I was here. It doesn't all get done by magic. It's difficult. And I put in my time and I put in my effort and I put love into everything that I do. And if you can't see that, that's not on me, that's on you.
Yeah.
I'm sorry that you feel unloved by me, but it's just a feeling. Because I've gone way out of my way to show you guys how much I care about you and how much I care about your spiritual well-being. And because I care so much about the spiritual well-being of the kids in this church, I cannot, with good conscience, turn my back on a bunch of kids who stroll into our midst, listen to our message, try to assimilate into this country club that will never have them. I said, I've watched a lot of things happen here over the past 6 months or so. I've kept my mouth shut about a lot of it. But looking around at the lynch mob around me, the only thing that is missing from this scene is the noose. You people should really, really, really be ashamed of yourselves. Because if I was one of those people who was brought here for Bring a Friend Day, I would be leaving skid marks out of this parking lot to get back out on that highway as fast as I could. And one guy jumps in and says, well, you know what? Then that's where you belong. Out there on that highway. Get out on that highway. Get out of here and get on that highway. And I said, oh. I said, well, I'm sorry, was that actually directed at me? Is this a directive that you're giving me to get on the highway? Or is that just a knee-jerk response to what I just said? I said, in either case, what you're saying here basically is that even though God is not willing that any should perish, as far as you're concerned, I can go to hell. Mm-hmm. That pretty much cover it? I said, you know what? From what I can see of the attitudes of the people in this church, you do not want this place to be someplace that is hospitable to outsiders. Your name is a fraud if this is the way that you approach the gospel. I said, when I read my Bible, I see my Lord and Savior telling me that it is not the well that need a physician, it's the sick. And I see my Lord and Savior telling me that it is my job to go out there and preach the gospel to anyone who will hear it. Everyone has an equal shot at salvation.
Yeah.
Now, if all you want is for somebody to come in here and perpetuate this country club mentality, I had no idea what the word microculture was at that point.
Yeah.
I said, if you want someone who's just going to come in here and perpetuate this country club mentality that you are attempting to create within these walls, if all you want is someone who is going to come in here and help you raise up an army of marshmallow fluff Christians who are going to cringe every time someone lights up a cigarette or uses a bad word in their presence, you know what? As far as I'm concerned, you can have that, but you will never have it with me as your youth director. So decide how you want it to be. Do you want this church to fulfill its mission, or do you want it to be a country club? Because I'm in for option A. You can keep option B.
Yeah.
And they decided, didn't they? You know what? You were not allowed into that meeting.
Nope. I actually did get into like a little argument with one of these women. Mm-hmm. And I could not believe what I was hearing. And I spent the whole time you were in there just sobbing my eyes out because I was like, I don't understand these people. I don't understand why they hate so much. And I didn't understand back then. I didn't understand why they hated so much. And I was like, I don't understand. Aren't we supposed to love people? Aren't we supposed to want the best for them and to help them on their way to,
wherever it is they're going in life.
Right. Aren't we supposed to do that? And if we're not supposed to do that, what are we doing here? What are we doing here? Why are we wasting time? Why are we wasting time here? And it was just, and the youth pastor's wife is sitting down, patting my shoulder and saying, oh, it happened to us when we first came here. It all blows over in the end. And I'm thinking to myself, if it happened when you guys came here, why has nothing changed? Why haven't these people grown up? Why haven't these people grown a spine?
I mean, he sat there in that room with me alone and had a couple of very positive conversations with me about these kids.
Yeah.
And then as soon as one of his board members' kids was offered a cigarette, it's like, oh, no, they have to go. They have to go. Now, he never came out and said they have to go.
But he threw you under the bus.
He completely threw me under the bus. And as word of that got around to these kids...
Oh, yeah.
It wasn't long before we saw the last one gone for good.
Oh, yeah. Like the next week, they are all gone.
Yeah, the vast majority of them, it didn't take long.
Oh, yeah.
I mean, they weren't exactly given a warm welcome by these people on their mission. No. They didn't exactly get greeted with a holy kiss, now did they?
No.
No, not at all. And it was at that point where I really started wondering, whether or not I was ever going to figure out a way to make anything good out of this.
Yeah.
And I started thinking about a couple of different verses, but this is the one that I kept coming back to. As I thought about them and I thought about the situation, the only thing, and here's a kitty, the only thing that kept going through my mind at that point was Matthew 23:27. Woe unto you, scribes and Pharisees, hypocrites! For ye are like unto whited sepulchres, which indeed appear beautiful outward, but are within full of dead men's bones and of all uncleanness.
Yeah.
If there was one way that I can say that meeting felt, it felt unclean.
Yeah.
It felt ugly.
Oh, yeah.
And you talked about the concept of hate. And I've talked about the concept of hate and how this religion packages hate and calls it love. Packages it up in nice, pretty packages, spouts platitudes about loving the sinner and hating the sin, and all the while just not wanting anything to penetrate their little cloister.
Yeah.
And that was what this church was. There were so many other stories. And now that this framework is out there, I can build on it.
Right.
And I can talk about these things as they become more relevant. I guess you could really count this one as the third part in the abandoned fundamental flaws
Yeah.
series, because this deals directly with one of the things that these people consider to be fundamental, and that is the church and its mission.
Right.
Okay? Well, if your mission is to create a microculture around messaging of hate and intolerance and being able to decide who's better than anybody else in your midst and getting rid of the ones that you consider undesirable, well, then I guess you're doing your job. But the problem is that that's not what your mission was or is. Every time I go back to that website, it's just the same old, same old. So that tells me that it's the same old gospel being preached there from the same old angle by the same old pastor. And what's happening is that the same old hate and rhetoric is propagating, not just in this church, but in many, many, many churches out there.
Yeah.
Stories like this aren't unique. I'm certain that there will be someone listening to this who is going to think to themselves, oh my God, this sounds so much like what we went through. Because like I've said before, people aren't all that different, especially when they start getting fed the Kool-Aid.
Yeah.
They're not all that much different. So if they're taught to believe that their church is a cloister, that's how they're going to see it. The name of this place was such a bitter irony, because they really wanted to reflect something to the community that they were never willing or able to offer it. They were the quintessential whitewashed tomb. Mm-hmm. And I can only imagine that they still are. I have no idea what their reputation is in their community. They were never all that assuming to begin with. So I'm guessing that they're just sort of still there doing what they do, not really pissing anybody off, but not doing any good for humanity either.
Yeah.
But you know what? That's pretty much every church out there, isn't it? Especially churches that don't see growth for years and years and years. The gospel of microculture is a problem.
Yeah.
And it has been for a long time and will continue to be because of the narrow way that these people are taught to think. I did something that I don't normally do with these shows. They're pretty much 100% ad lib. I'm looking at the amount of raw audio that I have at this point. I'm not even going to say how much, because I feel like there's a lot that's going to get sliced and diced out of here, because I do want to make sure that I'm conveying concepts and not emotions. But this is an emotional concept, and it should be. It's something that still makes me angry 30 years later, and it should, in a righteous way. I don't think that I was motivated to do any episode of this show so far the way that I was this one. And not to get back at anyone for anything, because I still hold firm to the belief that you shouldn't hold charge against individuals. But I'm really not sure if I can blame the religion for everything that I saw in this guy. I'm not sure that I can blame all of it on that kind of thinking, because there were other things that were going on beneath the surface. Attitudes that I saw, certain little things that he used to say, and the way that he said them, and the belittling way that he would say them. There were all kinds of little hints. They were subtle, but they were there. And these are things that you don't think about until you're out of that environment and you have the opportunity to think about them. I just wanted to end off, and this is the part of the show where I turn my full attention to the listener. Actually, before I do that, anything you want to end off with?
No, but I do think that this experience basically killed off any type of desire I really had to go into the ministry. I couldn't see opening myself up. I still wanted to, because I knew that I still felt like I should, but I was like, I can't deal with this every single time.
Yeah, no. And I felt the exact same way, although we did go on a few more interviews after that.
Yeah, we did. And it was just still this really unhappy feeling. You know, it was kind of like, I feel like I'm putting myself in prison.
Exactly. And it just went back to that guy it went back to the guy that professor brought in to speak to that class when I was in college.
Yeah.
And it was the same sort of thing. Every place that I went to interview, I started telling myself, if you hang out with these people, you're going to become like them.
Yeah. And I didn't want to be like these women.
No. And I didn't want to be like any of those men. And a couple in particular.
Yeah.
That to this day, I can hear their voices. I can see their faces. I can see the arrogance and the smarm.
Yeah.
And what am I going to thank? Thank myself for having the brains enough to never let go of these thoughts, to never let go of rational thought, to never put myself in a place where I was letting someone else do my thinking for me. I'm thankful for all of that, because that's what helped me to get and stay unbound once and for all, was the fact that I was always in there, that my brain never stopped working. I've said it before. And put someone like that into that kind of microculture, and things are going to explode. And they did.
Yeah.
Now, just so that it doesn't sound like I'm pointing fingers in every other direction and not at me. Yes, I was young, I was green, I was arrogant. Any moniker that you want to put on me, you're probably right. My attitude probably wasn't the best through all of it in dealing with other people, but I was young and I was angry, and there were other things that played into that. The frustration of understanding just how far off from their church's name's mandate they were was very frustrating for me. I feel like I did a very good job of putting on the face when I was there. I feel like I did a good job of being compliant. But I didn't do a very good job of being silent when I saw shit that I didn't like. That I thought went contrary to what our mission was supposed to be. And because that pretty much meant that I was going to be presenting ideas that these people didn't like, there was no way I was going to last there for very long. And yes, it opened my eyes to a lot of things. And this experience is one that I keep going back to and saying, you know what? Back in a time when I was questioning whether or not I was doing the right thing in getting out of the ministry, there are just all kinds of things from this experience that I would just pull from and say, do you really want to go back to this? Because there's no such thing as greener pasture. Do you want to go back to this? And every single time I brought up something, in my head about this experience. It's like, find another way. I didn't say just walk away from it, but my brain just kept saying, find another way. And then shortly after this, the whole blow up with the assemblies and my credentials and all of that. And it just kept going in my head, find another way. Now, back then, it meant find another way to be in the ministry or do ministry work or be a good Christian or whatever. Just find another way. Well, eventually, I found another way, didn't I? And it had everything to do with just ditching all of this bullshit and purposing in my head to simply live a right life because it was right, not because I would win a prize. And I still believed in the prize, but I also thought that it was a whole lot more important to develop personal integrity than it was to do something simply because I wanted to go to heaven. Now, I don't normally do this, but for this episode, I actually prepared an ending that I want to read. This is going to take you right to the end, and we're going to say goodbye until next week after this. A lot to think about. Yeah, I'm leaving in a couple of those pregnant pauses because I think that they warrant you stopping and thinking about what I just said. But I want to talk directly to anyone listening who has been part of one of these ill-fated missions in a church that is exclusionary and microcultural and is full of people who are getting their cues from leaders who wear as many faces as there are people to wear them in front of. I don't care how many outreaches your church holds, how many missionaries it supports, how many people have been led to the Lord in a given year. All you are learning is a flawed gospel of self and of hate. It is making you prejudiced. It is teaching you that some people are better than others. It is teaching you that some people are worth sharing the gospel with and that some aren't. It has nothing to do with any biblical mandate. The only reasons they care one iota about drawing people in are simple, and they are obvious. It boosts their collective ego to have other people agree with them and be convinced by them to accept these fairy tales as truth. And it helps having people around to indoctrinate and cultivate into more whitewashed tombs so this thing can continue. Just a bunch of pretty sepulchres lined up in the pews, safe in their little cloister, looking pretty but accomplishing nothing, just like always. If your church looks anything like the one that I described in this episode, I have several wake-up calls for you. First and foremost, your church's mission is one of hate. Your church's mission is one of gentrification. Your church's mission is one of prejudice. Your church's mission is one of arrogance. Your church's mission is one of exclusion. And last but not least, your church's mission flies in the face of anything your so-called Savior had to say about dealing with people. I see Jesus reclining at the table with publicans and sinners. That wasn't allowed in this place. They were too concerned about their youth. I was concerned about them too, because I really didn't want to see them turn into what was in that office. If your church hasn't grown in years, and bringing in new people when other people leave or die isn't growth. Once again, it's churn. I mean, I know how much these guys love the economic stuff, so let's just put that out there. If your church hasn't grown in years, it's because most people still walk through your doors with enough sense to know that they're looking at a facade. And just one more parting thought, and again, I'm speaking in very general terms here. I'm not talking about any specific church. I'm just saying if your church looks anything like this, just one more little bit of advice. If you ever have occasion to do so, never organize a lynch mob against your youth director on Bring a Friend Day. It just looks bad. If you're in one of these churches and you're having trouble deciding to just stop going, first thing I want you to do is go back to episode 10 and listen to the last 15 minutes or so. You made it through this entire episode, and here you still are. There's a reason for that. The capstone on that tomb that you find yourself in can be removed. It's not easy, but it can be done. Get out of that cold, dark place that leaves you feeling isolated. Get away from the people who lured you into that box to begin with. Let a little light and warmth into your perception of things. Shove that stone out of your way. Decide right now that you've walked out of that church for the last time. Reject their mission of hate once and for all, and start getting unbound. We hope you enjoyed this episode of Unbound. Show topics are chosen based on their timeliness, relevance, and social impact. Have suggestions for future topics? Email us at unbound.podcast.network@gmail.com with all your comments and feedback. Please don't forget to like, share, and throw a few 5-star ratings our way, and follow us on all major social platforms. And don't forget to hit subscribe if you haven't already. Links to our social pages, as well as a full list of cited sources in today's episode, are listed in the show notes, available at our website, getunbound.org. That's get-unbound.org. If you value this resource and would like to see it continue, please consider supporting us on Patreon at the link in the show description. And be sure to check for new updates every Sunday when we'll come together again and take one more step toward getting and staying unbound.